Hello, it's been a while since I've made a video because Christmas and things like that have gotten in the way, but I just thought I'd hop on today to answer a question that I've been asked a few times recently, and that's how I get sketches from a sketchbook onto watercolour paper to create finished pictures. Now obviously you could just sketch directly onto your watercolour paper, but there's a couple of reasons why I prefer not to do that. Firstly, you probably end up at some point having to rub out the lines that you've made, and if you're repeatedly sort of making changes to your drawing and rubbing things out, that can actually damage the surface of the paper and make the paints behave a little differently than you'd expect when you try and paint. Also, if you've pressed a little too hard with your pencil, it can be difficult to remove those marks, as I'm finding here. And of course, sometimes you'll just draw something in your sketchbook that you're so pleased with that you want to work it into a painting, and you know that if you try and draw it again on the watercolour paper, you're not going to do it right. For me personally, I find that drawing at a smaller scale like this allows me to more accurately capture the right proportions of my subject and the shapes, and so I prefer to work small like this and then scale it up onto the watercolour paper. So when it comes to transferring an image to watercolour paper, there's a couple of different ways we can go about it. One of them I'm going to show you today is really obvious, you've probably done it before in school, and the second way that I'm going to show you is a little more unconventional because it has drawbacks, but it's my favoured technique. Now, of course, if you have access to a light box, you can trace your sketch, if it's at the right size, onto your watercolour paper. I often work with watercolour blocks like this though, and with a block, all four sides of the paper are gummed down except for a small area here where you can get a knife in when you want to loosen the page. And that is to stop or reduce the amount of wrinkling that you'll get when you add a lot of water to the page. But it does also mean that you can't put something underneath to trace through a light box. So you have to use a different way of getting your image onto the paper. So I'm going to start by scanning in the images from my sketchbook. So the scan doesn't need to be particularly high resolution or good quality, as long as we've got the basic sketch there. And then you open it up in Photoshop or Affinity or whatever image editing software you use. I'm using Procreate because I actually deleted my Photoshop subscription. I actually deleted my Photoshop subscription last year, and I found that everything I want to do, I've been able to do in Procreate just fine. So I've isolated the duck that I'm going to use, just hide that bit. And now I'm just going to enlarge that to the size that I want to paint him at. This is an A4 piece of paper. So let's go with something like that, and let's turn him round as well, just to save on space. Now, because you can see that scanned paper texture there, what I need to do is adjust the curves on this image. So we're making the whites whiter and just basically getting rid of that background, because we're going to print this off and we don't want to be printing off all of that background colour as subtle as it is, because it's going to waste ink and it'll take longer. So this doesn't have to look good as long as we can see the sketch, and then we're just going to send it to the printer. So you can see I actually added another duck onto that page, and I printed it in black and white just to save on the coloured ink. And what I need to do now is transfer that onto the watercolour paper, and I'm going to start by scribbling over the back of it with graphite. Now I don't know what you call this, but it's basically a big chunky solid graphite lead in a holder. You could also use one of these, which is a sort of extra fat pencil, compare it to a normal one, which will make the job quicker, but you can of course just do it with a normal pencil. Now I'm using 6B. Anything from sort of 2B onwards would be better. And we're just going to scribble over the back of it. In fact, I'm going to move the watercolour paper because of the texture. Now, we don't need to go over the whole page. We only need to lay graphite down where that outline is that we're going to draw over. So it's quite a good idea, if you can, to hold it up to a window and see where those lines are and do it that way. Okay, so I've just neatened up those lines. It didn't take long at all with this big chunky lead. And now we can place that image onto the watercolour paper. Now, if this was a really complex image that I was tracing, I would use some tape or maybe a bulldog clip to hold that paper in place. But this is just a really simple outline. I'm confident that I'm not going to move the paper while I do it. And my favourite thing to use to trace these lines down is a biro, because the end is just sort of round enough that it's not going to damage the paper or indent the watercolour paper below too much. And also the ink will show up better than a pencil will, so you can see where you've already drawn lines and where you still need to go. So we're just going to trace over that outline that we printed off. So if I just peel this back carefully, maybe just go over this bit again, just to check we've got all those lines. Okay, so there's the duck traced onto the watercolour paper. Now we do still have the problem that I mentioned earlier, that we've got some pencil lines there that we will need to erase, but it's a manageable amount of rubbing out. We're not drawing and redrawing and constantly scrubbing at the surface of the paper. And when I paint animals like this in watercolour, I usually use a pen outline. So my next step would be to go in with the ink, go over these lines again, and then rub out this pencil before I put the paint on. But I'm not going to do that now. I'm going to show you the second method that I use for transferring images onto paper ready for painting. Now, this technique, as I said, it has some drawbacks and it might seem like a bit of a faff, but I much prefer it as a way of laying down my outlines onto paper ready to paint. So I'm starting with my sketchbook, and I'm not going to use the scanner this time. Instead, I'm going to just take a photo of that directly with my iPad. I've got in Procreate, and you could do this in Photoshop or whatever, I've got an A4 document open because that's the size of paper that I want to do my painting on. And then into there, I'm going to add that photo that I just took. And let's pick one of these. Let's do this golden eye. He looks quite nice. So I'm just going to really roughly cut him out and hide that bit. And then I'm going to enlarge that so that it's the size that I want to paint at. Let's go something like that. Now with this duck, I'm just going to paint the duck and then I'm going to use him possibly as part of a larger illustration with other birds. But if this was going to be a finished painting, you could use this point to work out your composition. You know, do you want your sketch down here? Do you want to enlarge it and crop part of it off? Whatever you want to do, this is the point to work it out. And then I'm going to reduce that layer's opacity and create a new layer above it. And now we're going to go over those lines. And I'm going to use one of my favourite brushes for this, which is the dry ink brush that comes with Procreate in the inking set. And I've got it pretty much to its lowest, thinnest size. Now that's really important, that this line is very, very thin, and I'll explain that and I'll explain why that is later. So I'm going to go over these lines and I'm going to be quite careful about it and take my time and get them right, and you'll see why in a minute. But what I want to avoid is sort of having repeated lines like this, that like where I'm working in a sort of sketchy way, and I also don't want heavy thick lines like that. I just want a nice thin outline. that sort of represents the final drawing, if that makes sense. So at this point, this technique does seem to be taking a little longer, but actually for me, it doesn't. Overall, this is much quicker and much more efficient than scanning in my sketchbook. Getting that big scanner out is a pain, and then having to sort of print that off and everything. This is just putting in a little bit more work here at this drawing stage, but overall reducing the amount of steps needed. So if there were any changes that you wanted to make to your original sketch, this is the point at which to do it. But there I've covered all the outlines that I need. So I'll hide that sketchbook layer and I've just got my drawing. Looking at it now, the duck's head looks a bit weird, but I'm just going to keep going with it because I've done it now. And what we're going to do now is print this directly onto the paper that I'm going to use to paint on. So this technique does slightly depend on the printer that you have and whether it can handle heavier weight papers. I've never tried it on this sort of cold pressed or textured watercolour paper. I don't think my printer would like that, but I have used this technique on various other papers. So this is Bristol, which is a really smooth white heavyweight paper. This is the printed outline, and then these ones had the outline and I've coloured them in. And what's that? That's Bristol board again. The great thing about this technique is you can print out or duplicate the image as many times as you want. So here I was testing out different materials for colouring in the same image, and it allowed me to do a direct comparison, which was fun. And I did the same thing there, and that's watercolour paper. Hot pressed watercolour paper, so it's reasonably smooth, but it went through the printer just fine, and you can see what that drawing layer looked like. Now this is a brilliant technique if you've got a really detailed image that you need to transfer onto the watercolour paper, because you're not having to trace it, you're not having to sort of make sure the paper doesn't slip or anything like that. You don't end up with lots of graphite powder like you might with the first method. You just get a lovely clean line. But this is an inkjet printer that I'm about to use, so those lines are not permanent. They're going to be water soluble, so when I come to add watercolour, which this is, they could bleed slightly. If I show you, actually that's not too bad, but it is bleeding a little bit. And that's why it's really important to keep that line very thin. And also, when I print onto the watercolour paper, I'm going to reduce the opacity of the image so that it's not printing completely black. It's going to be very pale, and that will reduce any amount of bleeding or sort of contamination of the colours that I'm going to lay down. The paper that I'm going to use for these ducks is this fine grain heavyweight paper, which is 200 GSM, so it's a fairly thick paper, but it isn't a watercolour paper. It's a drawing paper. I've used gouache and acrylic gouache on it, absolutely fine. And watercolour works if you're just using a little bit of water and you're not going overboard and you're not trying to fill the whole page with colour. So I think for my purposes it will probably be okay. Also, as I said, I'm going to scan the ducks in and use them as part of a larger illustration, so I don't really care if this paper wrinkles, which it will. And there's the finished print. I actually added another duck underneath as well, so as not to waste paper. I don't know how well those lines will show up on camera, but you just have to trust me that they're there. They're faint so that they're not going to interfere with the painting, but they're nice and visible to work with. Going into the next stage of the painting, for me it's much easier to work with these thin very precise, clean lines than this, which we got from the first technique, which is much blotchier. They're going to be harder to erase and cover up. It's just a nicer image to work with. And as I said, it's much better if you're working with a very detailed image as well. This paper is one of my favourite papers to use for very detailed graphite work. It's really beautiful to work on. And this technique of printing the outline works really well with detailed graphite, partly because you don't have to worry about smudging these lines here. If you're working for a long time up in this area, it's not going to smudge because it's not graphite. But also if you're adding lots and lots of detail and effectively colouring this in with graphite and you need to rub some of it out because you've made a mistake, you can rub as much as you want away and you'll still have that initial drawing that you're working from. You don't have to worry about getting rid of that as you erase. And one of the reasons that I'm not too concerned about this thinner paper crinkling as I work is because I'm not actually going to use watercolour paints on this one. I'm going to use water-soluble pencils, pencil crayons, which need a lot less water. But first, I need to work in the outlines. So I'm just using a fine liner. It's very thin, 0.05, and this is permanent ink, so it won't bleed or run with the watercolour on top. I get a lot of comments about how I hold my pens. Yeah, it is weird, you're right. It's just how I've always held them, and I think it's partly because I have really long fingers and partly perhaps because I'm double jointed as well, so this is just the way it works for me. Don't do what I did and forget which bird it is you're painting. This is a goldeneye, and I just started colouring it in like it was a widgeon, and partway through I was like, well, that's weird, they don't have those white patches there. It's because it's a different duck. Hopefully I can get rid of this. And start again. like his legs. I made a bit of a mess of those, and I realised after I put that initial pen layer down on top of the printed lines that I needn't have done that, because I was only going to go back in afterwards after I'd done the paint to darken those lines anyway, so I made a bit more work for myself there than was necessary. But you can see the paper's held up really well actually to the amount of water I used, especially considering I got quite carried away here and put quite a lot of water on it, and it's barely sort of wrinkled at all. So there you go, that's how I transfer my sketches onto watercolour paper.